the Poles and the Baltic republics and the Ukrainians, they all understand Russia is always going to be a bad neighbor. It's going to be one degree of threatening or another. They at least have a realistic view of what they're facing. Whereas a lot of ideologues in Western Europe and then in the United States, they believe that a liberal and democratic Russia really is possible. But of course, these are the same people who thought that a liberal and democratic Afghanistan or Iraq was also going to be possible, and all we needed to do was give it a push.
Writing in Compact, Daniel McCarthy argues Volodymyr Zelensky, quote, must go after the Ukrainian president's disastrous public meeting with Donald Trump last week. And McCarthy's not alone. After the Trump team asks Zelensky to leave the White House without signing that mineral deal on Friday, Senator Lindsey Graham, one of Zelensky's staunchest supporters, called on him to step down. So did House Speaker Mike Johnson. They're both Republicans, obviously, so let's take a listen.
What I saw in the Oval Office was disrespectful. And I don't know if we can ever do business with Zelensky again. I think most Americans saw a guy that they would not want to go in business with. The way he handled the meeting, the way he confronted the president was just over the top. So I think the relationship between Ukraine and America is important, vitally important. But can Zelensky do a deal with the United States? After what I saw, I don't know.
Speaker, Senator Lindsey Graham on Friday floated the idea that President Zelensky may need to resign in order for there to be a peace agreement. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, something has to change. Either he needs to come to his senses and come back to the table in gratitude, or someone else needs to lead the country to do that. I mean, it's up to the Ukrainians to figure that out.
Now, Senator Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont, disagreed.
Do you think that President Zelensky needs to resign in order for there to be a peace deal?
I think that is a horrific suggestion. Zelensky is leading a country trying to defend democracy against an authoritarian dictator, Putin, who invaded his country.
And Zelensky himself seems to disagree. That may not come as a surprise. Asked about Lindsey Graham's statement, the embattled Ukrainian president told Sky News over the weekend that while he'd step down if Ukraine were admitted to NATO, basically a non-starter with this administration, quote, to change me, he said, would not be easy because it is not enough to simply hold elections. You would need to prevent me from participating, and it will be a bit more difficult. Now, Graham replied to that interview by posting on X, quote, unfortunately, until there is an election, no one has a voice in Ukraine. Just as we were recording this on Monday morning, actually, Trump posted to Truth Social reacting to Zelensky saying the end of the war was, quote, very, very far away. Trump replies, quote, this is the worst statement that could have been made by Zelensky, and America will not put up with it for much longer. What does that mean in the context of these calls for Zelensky to resign? Daniel McCarthy, editor-in-chief of Modern Age, is our guest for today. And in Compact this morning, he wrote, quote, if there is any hope for constitutional republicanism in this situation, it lies in committing America to peace and diplomacy with our European security colonies required to align their policies with ours. Ukraine should remove Zelensky and replace him with a leader who will stanch his nation's bleeding. Daniel joins us now to break all of this down. Daniel McCarthy, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Emily.
So you've written this article, Why Zelensky Must Go, and it actually goes back to George Washington, which invokes sort of the way George Washington and the Founding Fathers saw some of these foreign entanglements, as they would have put it. Can you tell us, before we dive into like the big news from the last several days, how the founders saw these problems and then tie it into what we've seen over the last few days, Daniel?
Yeah, the Founding Fathers knew their history, and they also had a very keen sense of strategic geography. So when they looked at the European continent, when they looked at its history, when they looked at the series of endless wars that had taken place over centuries, sectarian wars between different Christian factions or between Christians and Muslims, ethnic wars between neighbors, and of course, many, many wars of geography and borders. The Founding Fathers said, we are very fortunate not to be part of that mess, because they didn't think there was any way to sort out all of these inveterate conflicts in Europe, which have been going on for a millennium or more. They saw America as being a relatively, sort of free and open land where you did not have those pre-existing entanglements going back centuries. And therefore, you could start a new kind of republic on the American continent and not have it be drawn into the endless conflicts of Europe. And so they wanted to have a new kind of government right here, sort of popular republic that would be self-governing, that would not be driven by the kinds of ambitions or the kind of historical, fears, animosities, hatreds that had been so characteristic of European states. This was a chance to start again without having a pre-established record of hating certain people or fearing certain people are going to attack you. This would be a kind of new beginning, not only for America, but it would be a model for the world. And what they feared was that the same kind of animosities that were so endemic in Europe would eventually come to our country, either by through immigration, with people having resentments that they carried on from the old world to the new, or that we would get ourselves involved in the kinds of imperial entanglements and long-standing conflicts that the Europeans had never been able to resolve for themselves.
Well, that's really interesting because it's this anti-colonial realism almost, if we're viewing it through the prism of history. But I mean, it's fascinating because the deal that Trump is staking out here is like this massive mineral, as the Telegraph put it when they broke the news, quote, economic colonization of Ukraine. But Trump would argue that it's his sort of middle ground, that it's like sort of the only way out of the conflict. And I'm curious through the dynamic of weak states and strong states, as you write about in this piece, which is super, super interesting, the way that we've seen the dangers of weak states over the centuries, really, how that challenges all of this. The fact that this is all kind of the question at hand on Friday at that meeting was a sort of economic colonization deal. It's sort of an interesting wrench in the conversation.
It is. And even if we go back to the founding fathers, they had a very keen sense of the idea that economic interests were things that could be negotiated. Economic interests, there was some rational element to them. There was usually a way to get a win-win deal. So they thought that that was, a good level on which to have diplomatic negotiations. Whereas when you get into the questions of morality, questions of ethnicity, whose language is, going to be dominant in a particular area, those are the kinds of identity questions that you just cannot solve. So I think that even what Trump's doing with this so-called economic colonization, as some of the perhaps critics or lukewarm supporters have called it, is very much in keeping with the vision of the founding fathers. They probably would have been a little more skeptical of getting involved at all. But if we were going to get involved, at least get involved in a way that involves material interests that could be negotiated among different partners. You can divide up a dollar. You can't divide up an ethnicity, or if you try to divide up a church, you're going to wind up with a conflict. A dollar you can divide up much more easily. Mineral rights you can divide up much more easily. So that's what I think Trump was trying to do, and he was trying to find a way to provide a certain kind of guarantee through economics for the Ukrainians, for their security, without telling the Russians, hey, we're coming in here, we are making decisions about what the borders are, what the language is, what churches are going to be, affiliated with the state or not affiliated with the state. All of these extremely sensitive identity questions, America was going to sidestep entirely by focusing on mineral rights and economics.
Yeah, I think that's something that's easily misunderstood about this particular deal is that it's that quote unquote economic colonization actually in the interest of unraveling decades of intense involvement, like post-Soviet involvement in this region of the world. Trump really sees it as the off-ramp, which is actually a totally different scenario than an incursion, a colonial incursion. He sees this as sort of a step back.
And it's a step back from ideology as well, because in the post-Cold War era, we've had this kind of liberal internationalist ideology, which has dominated Washington. Most of our allies in Europe have subscribed to it as well. And an ideology, it's unfortunate, but in some ways, there were even, individuals like Irving Kristol, the so-called godfather of neoconservatism, self-described himself that way, who said after the end of the Cold War that, America is an ideological country just like the Soviet Union was, and, we're going to have interest in everywhere and in everything because ideology is so comprehensive. So, you had people like Francis Fukuyama writing his, thesis about the end of history, this idea that all the world was going to come around to liberal democracy. And then maybe, some policymakers in Washington thought all that was needed was for America to accelerate the process by knocking over a few, sort of retrograde, rogue state regimes. And then the whole process of global democratization and liberalization and economic integration could all take place. And of course, what we've seen in, the last 30 years is that in fact, this led us into war after war after war, and basically none of them ended in complete success. All of them left, kind of bad taste in Americans' mouths as they said, why did we sacrifice life and limb and trillions of dollars just to get, an outcome where now Iran has, an enormous amount of power in Iraq, where in Afghanistan, we fought the Taliban for 20 years, and at the end of the day, the Taliban are in control. And now I think there's a legitimate fear on the part of the American people that you're seeing the same sort of thought processes and the same sort of ideologically driven commitments taking place in Ukraine, where there isn't a definition of victory that seems realistic. There isn't a game plan or a set of steps that would get us to victory. Instead, it's simply, well, we're going to keep doing what we're doing for the sake of ideological commitments. And also because there is this certain logic that, during the Cold War, the point of NATO was to stop the expansion of Soviet communism. It was a revolutionary ideology, and that was the thing that had to be prevented from spreading. And it would spread, of course, not just by ideas, but really through Soviet tanks rolling into European countries. Even then, we did not use NATO to liberate Czechoslovakia or to, strike back against the Soviets whenever they rolled into Czechoslovakia or into Hungary. So we had a sort of balance of power there, which is, it's not that a balance of power is a morally good thing necessarily, but there was a degree of stability. There was an understanding on the part of the two superpowers that was, and that was successful enough that it prevented any kind of nuclear exchange. In the post-Cold War era, however, there really has been this sense that, well, now we have to address not the ideological problem of Soviet communism and its power, but rather these, problems of geography, involving states on the borders of Russia, which have always had, this very perilous path to find, to, not be, caught up in conflicts between Russia and Germany. It's historical and it goes back centuries. Now this is something that NATO is going to try to resolve, and it's something where NATO is going to try to have a sort of permanent garrison, keeping the peace on the borders of Russia. And you just ask yourself, well, where does that end? If this has been going on for hundreds of years already, is America prepared to make a commitment for, not just, 5 years or 20 years, but for 200 years? That seems like a lot to ask of our Republican institutions. But if we're not willing to make that commitment, then what's left? Because, the Poles and the Baltic republics and the Ukrainians, they all understand Russia is always going to be a bad neighbor. It's very, very unlikely that there's ever going to be a liberal, democratic, benign government in Russia. It's going to be one degree of threatening or another. Now, so that's, they at least have a realistic view of what they're facing. Whereas a lot of ideologues in Western Europe and then in the United States, they believe that a liberal and democratic Russia really is possible. But of course, these are the same people who thought that a liberal and democratic Afghanistan or Iraq was also going to be possible, and all we needed to do was give it a push.
Right. No, great point. So why does then, logically, next step, why does the absence of Zelensky sort of solve this problem? Or why is it a sort of next step towards actually achieving peace, as you argue in the compact essay?
Yeah, so I mean, Zelensky, I think, went into this Oval Office meeting with President Trump and Vice President Vance and Secretary of State Rubio with, whether he was consciously thinking of this or not, in the back of his mind, he believed that he was the one holding the cards because America has already made this commitment to expanding NATO to the borders of Russia. America, in the last administration under Joe Biden, but also all of our, media and so much of our civil society has really created this mythology that, Ukraine's battle is a battle for all of Europe and a battle for even America itself. So I think Zelensky went in there with an excessive degree of confidence, bordering, in fact, and going beyond arrogance, simply because he thought America has already committed to this, Europe has already committed to this. It doesn't matter what the last election showed. It doesn't matter what, President Trump or Vice President Vance has to say. What matters, in fact, is this larger commitment that's been going on and building up for decades. And because he has that arrogance, he behaved in a very rude way. And, already President Trump and Vice President Vance were skeptical of Zelensky, and they wanted to make sure that we were approaching the Ukraine crisis in a realistic way and not in an ideological way. And Zelensky made that impossible. He insisted, constantly bickering about, all these points of, what's happening to his country and its history and so forth. And, it's perfectly understandable why a Ukrainian patriot would do that. But unfortunately, a statesman, including a Ukrainian statesman, really needs to have much colder blood than Zelensky has, and has to be able to be much more rationalistic and interest-based when talking about these things, and can't simply say this is about proving who's right and who's wrong. Because that, again, goes back to the very thing our founding fathers were afraid of, that, if you go back and forth, for centuries over who's right and who's wrong, that's something America can never resolve. If we get drawn into that, we can never get out. So
Right.
Zelensky, I think, has, made himself identical, in his own mind, he is identical with his country, with Ukraine. That's why he's canceled elections. It's why he can, act unilaterally. So he has made himself, not the representative of a democratic people who has been elected and, governs based on the authority that has been delegated to him by the people. Instead, now he thinks of himself as kind of the embodiment of the nation. And that too, I think, adds to his sense that, his personal honor is now at stake rather than the interests of his country. So all of these things, I think, make Zelensky very much disinclined to pursue a realistic kind of peace plan such as Donald Trump came up with. And I think, in fact, one of the reasons you don't have elections in Ukraine right now, and even people I've talked to who are very pro Zelensky in Washington, D.C., have admitted this to me,
Mhm.
that Zelensky would lose an election. And it's not because, necessarily that the peace party in Ukraine would be the strongest, faction if there were an election, but there would be voters who wanted to have new leadership that might be more successful, more diplomatically successful, or militarily successful than Zelensky has been for the last 3 years. So I think, he's personalized the war. He's personalized these conflicts, not only with Putin, but also now with Trump and with J.D. Vance. And that makes him an obstacle to the peace process. And I think if he were to resign, and if Ukraine were to find new leadership, whether it's through elections or whether it's through the appointment of, a leader who may not have democratic legitimacy, but at least has a clean slate, I think that would be a much fresher beginning and have better prospects for Ukraine to get the best possible deal here.
Hmm. Yeah, that was going to be my next question is actually does it matter whether he steps down or whether it's this happens through an election? Obviously the question of elections is enormously thorny and tangled right now because how you have an election when you have occupied territory and all of that is difficult, but does it matter if it's just that Zelensky steps down? As he says, it would have to be in exchange for NATO membership, which is basically off the table with the Trump administration. But would would it make a difference if it was just his decision, or if there's some, as you put it, democratic legitimacy?
Yeah, I think not only is democratic legitimacy a good thing in general, there's also the question of accountability and representation. So, certainly a leader who has a democratic mandate can be more confident in negotiations than one who doesn't have that. So that's one concern with Zelensky right now, having canceled the last round of elections. The other issue is that, we are quite rightly appalled by the way in which Vladimir Putin has completely suppressed and silenced the anti-war party in Russia. Any critic, within
Mhm.
his own country who wants to stop this war or says it should never have happened, is likely to be put in a gulag by Vladimir Putin. The Ukrainians don't go that far, but Zelensky also does not want to hear from anyone within his own country who dissents from Zelensky's rule and who says that the time has come to have negotiations and to seek peace. Now, note that while the Ukrainians and many of the Americans who, sort of give them a blank check, both morally and economically, and perhaps militarily too, if NATO gets put on the table, Americans who give them a blank check say, well, of course, you can't have elections when 20% of your country is occupied by an invader. But that's not the American view of things. We had elections in this country during the Civil War when much more than 20% of the country was occupied, by military forces that were not part of the Union. We also had elections during the Revolutionary War. So I'm living in Virginia right now,
Mhm.
and Virginia had elections. Thomas Jefferson became governor in an election that took place while you had redcoats, within Virginia territory. So you certainly can have elections, even, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. You could have elections when your country is at war, when it's occupied. It's difficult. The elections may be imperfect, but that's still better than nothing. It's still better than a guy who may not have either, the support of the military or the support of the public behind him. And it's better than simply excluding all of the voices that say we need to have a, somewhat more broad-minded, negotiated approach than simply saying, we're going to keep doing what hasn't worked for the last 2 or 3 years. We're going to keep doing that for another 2 or 3 years or another 20 years and, be happy with the results.
And just before we sat down here, Trump posted on Truth Social in response to Zelensky saying that the end of the war was, quote, very, very far away. Trump replied, "This is the worst statement that could have been made by Zelensky, and America will not put up with it for much longer." So, my last question is what should the Trump administration be doing? Should they be agitating for elections? Should they be pressuring him? As we saw Lindsey Graham, Lindsey Graham basically said he should step down. So is it to the point you were just making? in the Trump administration, is it better to suggest he stepped down really quickly, or to suggest that is it better for the end goal of getting a peace deal quickly, that Zelensky stepped down quickly, or that they somehow set up elections in a matter of weeks or months or something like that?
Yeah, and I do think the Ukrainians have several choices there, and I don't want to say that, my view as an outsider should overrule whatever their own feelings are. But I do think, logically, the most appropriate process would be for the Zelensky to resign quite soon, to turn over government to a caretaker, and then they can have elections on the
Okay.
timetable they think is realistic. And that way you get, you remove the obstacle to peace that Zelensky represents. You get fresh leadership with, sort of new opportunities immediately. And then you have a process providing democratic legitimacy and accountability and a representation of a broad spectrum of opinion. All of that gets registered in due course, and it doesn't have to be tomorrow, but it's something that should take place sooner rather than later. I mean, one of the concerns here is Zelensky has absolute power as long as the state of emergency remains, and that is kind of it's not that I think he's deliberately trying to prolong the war in order to hold on to power. But I think there is this, just the logic of the situation means that the longer the war goes on, the more he remains in power. His post-war future would be much more in question if the war ended. Even quite successful leaders. So, I think it's silly to compare Zelensky to Churchill, but even Churchill at the end of World War II lost the next election.
Right.
People wanted to change. They wanted to have, a kind of breath of fresh air. And so, Zelensky, again, it's not that I think he's consciously trying to prolong the war to hold on to power, but I think that, there is this subtle pressure there, which says, that he is the nation's at war, all these things fit together nicely right now. And he may be afraid psychologically that if he steps back and says, I'm not the sum total of Ukraine. And in fact, Ukraine is a country. It can choose another leader. It can choose another strategy, another path, and that path may be more successful. That would be a very, hard thing for someone like Zelensky to accept after all he's been through in the last 3 years. And of course, here I think many of our European friends are doing exactly the wrong thing because they're constantly building up Zelensky personally as if he is this messianic figure, as if he himself is, the thing upon which the outcome of the war totally depends. And that's wrong. Ukraine's a nation with national interests. Ukraine is a nation of millions of people. They have to be thought about, not simply Vladimir Zelensky and his feelings.
Daniel McCarthy, that was really helpful. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and talk this through.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you so much for tuning into this edition of Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Daniel is such an interesting guest. It was a pleasure to have him on the show as we think through what can be done. The ripple effect of that Friday meeting is going to be felt for likely years to come, more immediately for the days and weeks to come as this Trump administration continues trying to negotiate a peace deal with Ukraine. I'm curious if when Trump says, as he did just this morning, America, quote, will not put up with it for much longer, whether that means he will call for Zelensky to resign outright, whether they refuse to negotiate with Zelensky and Zelensky's allies in Ukraine any longer, if they demand new leadership in Ukraine in order to continue these negotiations. That's actually separate from whether the question of if it's easier to negotiate with other people, it's sort of different. If it's more practical, easier to negotiate with different people is a different question from whether they now are going to, whether they have to negotiate with Zelensky in order to get this deal done. Zelensky then saying he'll exchange himself for NATO membership and that the war is very, very far from being over tells me that he has probably and everyone else, that he probably has no intentions of stepping down anytime soon, digging his heels in deeper and deeper, and seems not interested in coming back to the table. That's what this indicates from my perspective, at least. So appreciate you tuning in. Remember, you can join the Undercurrents community where you get a special email address to get in touch with me and the team. You get a special paywalled episode once a week and all kinds of other premium benefits. So that's over at undercurrents.tv. Please subscribe here on YouTube, wherever you're downloading your podcasts, if you're listening there as well. And we'll see you back here with more Undercurrents soon.